Welcome to Not in the Handbook, podcast about workplace culture. Each episode, we discuss the bright side and the dark side of workplace cultures, from toxic leaders to susceptible followers to a conducive environment. In each episode, we share stories, observations, and insights. So join me as your host, Susan Hetrick, as we dive into this. Welcome to Not in the Handbook, and I'm joined today by Nick Basannavar. Welcome, Nick. Great to have you here.
Thanks so much, Susan. Great to be here.
Nick, before we get started, you have a very illustrious career. You are a social historian. You started your life as a social historian, have moved more into working in organisations and corporates. And I'm going to introduce your two books straight away. Is that okay?
Sure.
So your first book is a book that was, you did a lot of research in, which is called Sexual Violence Against Children in Britain since 1965. That was published in 2021. And The Key to Inclusion, a practical guide to diversity, equity, and belonging for you, your team, and your organisation, published the following year. And I understand that you have a novel that you're currently preparing. So it's great to have you. But I think when we met, your career is really interesting. It doesn't necessarily follow a kind of, you went in and did this job and then moved to that job and that job. Should we just start with you? Let's introduce you and tell us about yourself.
Thanks, Susan. And it's a real privilege to be here and really excited to continue our conversations. I suppose I've still not quite worked out what I want to do when I grow up. But I suppose there's been a few different themes that I've explored in my career. But maybe it's useful if I go back to the beginning, and some of the roots for my motivation probably lie there. So I'm born in London. I think I was always thinking about topics like culture and identity from a very young age. And one of the reasons for that is coming from a dual heritage background. So my mum is English with some Irish background as well. But my dad came from South India. He was born in pre-independence India in the 1920s. And I moved to the UK in the 50s to pursue a career as a philosopher, which he half did, but also went on to work for British Airways for almost 30 years. And I think, through that relationship and through some of his experiences, I was always thinking a lot about, race. I wasn't necessarily in a majority as I was growing up in my small town outside London. And I guess relations between people. So I guess that was there very early, and I think that's been a thread which has continued. You mentioned a book that I co-authored there with, edited by Stephen Frost, who's a former colleague of mine, which speaks about diversity, equity, and belonging. And again, personal experience also shaped my interest in that. So I lost my dad when I was 13. He had a very, very tough disability, which we lived with for a couple of years. So I think, again, that kind of, living with difference, how we, engage, include, hold people with care who are maybe different to us has also been something that was there from a very early age. And then I guess intellectual interests have gone this way and that, as you mentioned, history, business, and creativity as well have been close. I went and lived in Japan for 2 years at the start of my career as well, which is another big shaping influence. I taught English and history in the state sector there. And that was an amazing experience, get out and learn a new language, learn a different way of approaching culture. And many people speak about Japan as being a very different type of culture to the UK. Actually, what came through for me were the similarities. I don't know if that's due to the UK and Japan both being island nations. But, ultimately, when you're working with people, there are very common traits to human beings. And that was something which really stuck with me there. And one final thing on that is that I was able to apply some of that in my work later when I worked with Japanese organizations at one of our shared alma maters, Deloitte. So I worked with Japanese organizations for many years there, advising on strategy, HR leadership, things like that.
Do you want to say a little bit about how you came to write the two books? The first book, which is the one around sexual violence against children in Britain since 1965, and you touched on already the work around the key to inclusion. So do you want to say how you came to write those?
Absolutely, yeah. So the academic monograph on sexual violence, so that stemmed from my PhD research. So when I came back from teaching in Japan, I started my PhD at Birkbeck at the University of London. And the topic was really thinking about this very spoken about and extremely difficult, challenging topic around sexual violence against children, which has been, omnipresent. It's always been there in human history, but not necessarily spoken about, not necessarily understood as far as we might hope. So I sort of came at that from three angles. One was kind of activistic and think, there's a lot of horrible abuse that goes on. And I don't think that there's a very good structural framework that helps survivors. And part of that comes from a lack of knowledge about why it happens, how we've thought about it, how we've processed it. So that was one of the motivators to explore that work. Another was really, intellectually, it's comes across almost as a taboo topic. So I was very interested in why, linguistically, why culturally we struggle to talk about this topic, which affects so many lives. And then just a sense, I think, of real personal motivation to want to explore that. So yeah, I did my PhD there, did it part-time whilst working as an advisor in consulting as well. And that was an amazing process. I worked with some fabulous academics, like my supervisor, Professor Matt Cook, who's now the first ever professor of queer history at Oxford, which was a brilliant post for him to get. And he guided me through that process. He and other academics thought that the PhD was quite a natural book. So there's the way I constructed it was around 3 or 4 case studies, reaching back into the ancient worlds and ancient Greece, but as you pointed out, most of it's post-war in the UK. So looked at the Moors murders in the 1960s.
Yes.
The movement in the 1970s around the abolition of the age of consent, which is a highly controversial movement in the 70s. The Cleveland child sexual abuse scandal of 1987 in the Northeast, which was a really, I think, foundational moment for how we think about this, and also how we think about the family and childhood more broadly. And then the Jimmy Savile case, which kind of spanned that whole period. I think he made his debut on Top of the Pops in 1964 and died in 2011. And, that was a very well publicized, but again, little understood, I felt, case to explore. Yeah.
For listeners, do you want to say a little bit more about the Cleveland case? So, some people may not be so familiar. I think most people are very familiar with the Jimmy Savile case.
Yeah, absolutely. So Cleveland, 1987. Back then, Cleveland, it was a historic county in the UK, incorporating areas like Middlesbrough, Hartlepool and Redcar. And at the General Hospital there, 2 doctors had begun to uncover increasing numbers of suspected sexual abuse in children. They were using a new test called the RAD test, which had different responses, as I understand it, among medical professionals. But the upshot was that, many, many dozens more cases were uncovered than usually would be. And this caused a great storm among families who were having their children taken from them and put into care in some cases, among the local press and the national press, and ultimately in politics as well. And there was a huge amount of discourse around that. The doctors were vilified. Career-changing it was for them. For the book, I interviewed Dr. Jeffrey Wyatt, who was one of the 2 doctors involved. I did some oral history work with him, and quite extraordinary story. But ultimately, they were actually proven to be right in a lot of cases. So, and what happened in the end was almost a kind of missed opportunity to reckon with that and to think about, what that means for how we think about care, how we think about prevention, how we think about jurisdictional changes. Yeah, at the time there were a number of inquiries. Some of them recommended the introduction of mandatory reporting, which would effectively mean anyone who works in a position of care with children is mandated to report when they either see, hear about, or strongly suspect child sexual abuse. That still hasn't come in as law. The Labour government have introduced it as a bill in 2025, and it's now going, I believe, through the second reading in the House of Lords. So we're talking, almost 40 years on. And as Dr. Wyatt pointed out in some of his interviews with me, think about the dozens, hundreds, thousands of children who've, who we could have done better for.
Just to summarise here, what you're saying is that if doctors suspect, or anybody in the medical profession, I guess, or widen that, suspect that a child has been subject to sexual abuse, they're not mandated to report it currently.
Technically, however, in kind of best practice terminology, it does in practice happen.
Yes.
But it's not mandated by law.
Okay.
There are other countries which have, including Australia, I believe Ireland to an extent, Canada, but the UK hasn't. Now, I should point out, this is quite a controversial topic because I guess the demerits to mandatory reporting are a sense that you're creating a box ticking exercise where actually we need to think about this in a much more holistic way. There's also a lot of concern about the amount of casework that could stem from this as a result.
Yeah.
For example, police are already hugely overburdened. Again, I spoke to several senior police officers over the years, and hugely overburdened by, for example, the growth in digital abuse. And frankly, the resources may not be there. But the reality is that there is a lot of abuse that happens that people don't know about or think about.
Okay. Let's because that's a huge amount of trauma, and I think, when we think around trauma sort of also comes into organisations, they're not isolated. So people join organisations and everything else. And what do you think we could say that you felt when you're looking at the book that we've learned from those cases?
I think that's a really, really good question. I mean, I was thinking about this, and one of the things that becomes apparent is, whose voice gets listened to, who listens to inconvenient truth. So you had two doctors here. If you kind of make a parallel with modern day organisations, they effectively participated in a kind of speak up campaign. I wouldn't call it whistleblowing in the sense that they were just doing their jobs as they saw best, but they weren't taken seriously. It wasn't that the content of what they were saying was listened to. It was more the implications. And, there's a displacement of the actual abuse into worries about things like, well, what does this mean structurally for us as the NHS? What does this mean for the institution of the family in the UK? It started a big debate about who ultimately is responsible for children in this country. Is it the state? Is it the family? Is it medical professionals? So I think organisationally what was interesting was the system kind of fights back to survive when an inconvenient truth is surfaced. We also back then saw some really really awful gendered abuse. So the second doctor involved in the case was female, and the national press turned on her, demonized her. Again, these are people who are caring for children, who are portrayed as the abusers almost. And again, I think that's an interesting cultural quirk when we're faced with perhaps points of view that we are not accustomed to, or that really seem to rub against received wisdom in some way.
Yeah, I think this piece that you talk about, this inconvenient truth and whistleblowing, is very much at the heart of the matter. So very much at the heart of the matter of the work that I've done around toxic workplace and toxic workplace cultures. Very hard for individuals to raise concerns against a big corporate. Somehow we need to redress that. And everyone I talk to says it doesn't really work as well as we could. We talk about speak up initiatives. So I'm going to come Can we come now to kind of your work inside organisations? And the piece that when we talked about it, it was really intriguing, was that using philosophy in the workplace. And somehow philosophy and the workplace and corporate life doesn't always seem to mix. But tell us more about how you use philosophy in the workplace.
Absolutely, yeah. And maybe I can share a bit about how I kind of got there to start with that. But so as I mentioned, I was with Deloitte for several years. And, you know, at that time I was advising on, I actually trained in tax, which I was terrible at and hated. So I quickly moved away and into, a broader kind of HR advisory role, including, you know, things like leadership development and diversity and inclusion and so on. I then went over and helped to lead a boutique consultancy called Included. That's where the second book, The Key to Inclusion, came from. Stephen, who's the head of DEI at London 2012 Olympics and Paralympic Games, built a really fascinating business there, thinking about inclusion as a real leadership capability and a strategic imperative. And I ended up leading that organization and then went independent a couple of years ago. So I have now a portfolio of roles broadly looking at, you know, I think it all adds up to how do we think about organizational health? What do compassionate, healthy cultures look like? And there's a few different, you know, tools I bring to that. So one is inclusive leadership. And another is ethics and philosophy. Mainly through my work with an organization called Principia Advisory, which was founded in about 2012, 2013 by David Rodin, who's a professor of moral philosophy at Oxford. And I think that, so if I look at sort of the aspects I'm bringing to these different roles, there's a bit of history, there's a bit of philosophy, there's a bit of psychology, although I'm not a trained psychologist. But underlying it all is, you know, really what is it to be human in an organization and in a culture? And I think philosophy is a huge part of that. You know, it's been around forever, and it's not just a recent business trend. You know, you can go back to, I've just come back from a trip to India and looking at some of my dad's ancestral land and learning about, you know, some of the really, really ancient philosophy there. Of course, in the West, we know a lot about the Greeks. And so Principia effectively asks, you know, can philosophy help us make better decisions, perceive issues in a different way, help us engage with colleagues and stakeholders more healthily, and ultimately, you know, drive a more positive impact on the world? And I can talk a bit about some of the ways they do that.
Well, I do want you to
helpful.
talk a little bit about that, because what I found was really interesting was the principles that you talked around some of the philosophy. So, you know, many people in organisations would already know things such as, you know, try and do the greatest good for the greatest number of people, that you want to kind of do your best in the kind of the workplace. Some may even have taglines on value statements like "do the right thing," which it was from Aristotle. So there's a number of elements that we use in everyday life, in everyday corporate life, who may not be around. When we spoke, you talked around this triangle. Do you want to say a little bit more about the triangle to hold the idea about how you come into an organisation and get people to think about philosophy and how to make, as you say, the kind of ethical and the right decisions?
Absolutely. And I should preface this by saying as well that actually, you know, I think the need for this now is greater than ever. Or at least, you know, certainly in my working memory, I think we are living in incredibly tumultuous times. We're in a world where concepts like ethics are kind of under fundamental attack. You know, if we look at some of our esteemed leaders around the world and what they're doing to the rule book, and we're in an increasingly ethically challenging and complicated time. So I think I should preface this by saying that. But yeah, I mean the fundamental tool that we bring to the work is a kind of tri-lens one, right? So, and it effectively says that there are three ways of thinking about ethics in an organization. Ethics or moral philosophy, we can use those terms interchangeably. And those three things what we call the good, the right, and the fitting. So the good you actually alluded to when you spoke about the greatest good for the greatest number. So the good relates to a philosophical concept, an ethical concept called utilitarianism, also known as consequentialism, which effectively asks, what would be the right outcome here? So we're thinking very much in terms of results and outcomes. This has really strong roots in British ethicists like Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill. And, it effectively asks us to do a kind of calculation. When we're faced with an ethical problem, can we in some way enumerate what a different course of action might lead to? So it might be, for example, that we're thinking about whether to enter a new market. And actually there are some moral challenges in that market, perhaps around relating to the local government or politics. And so we might then want to think about identifying different stakeholders and what would be the impact on them. Ultimately we have customers, we have the political scene in that market, we have ourselves, we have the planet, and we'll map our stakeholders and think about it in that way. So yeah, effectively you're thinking what's the right consequence that will drive us.
So that in the kind of utilitarian, the greatest good for the greatest number of people, sit in kind of that area.
Yeah.
You'd be looking a broader range of stakeholders in how any decision in a corporation is made. You'd be thinking about what the consequences are, or you're asking people to think about that in a more broader,
Absolutely,
as opposed to an individual, but like creating policies, that it's not just for one individual example, but it's actually what does it mean for the rest of the organisation,
exactly,
and beyond.
Exactly, and also, and I think that's exactly right. And as well, we might think as well in terms of so often when leaders think about decisions, as you quite rightly allude to, they may be thinking in terms of this financial cycle, this quarter, this year, this 3-year strategy. I think what we also encourage people to do is think beyond that, but also to think about what the consequences might be, beyond the given decision, because you have the decision in front of you, but then there's the piece beyond, which is what we call the remainders, the moral remainders of a decision, which draws on the philosopher Bernard Williams's terminology. And that's when we're thinking about, and it's amazing how actually still, unfortunately, how little this is exercised, but what might be some of the consequences that aren't immediately apparent of our decision, but that nonetheless will exist. So a classic here might be, we make a decision that has split support in our organization among our employees. A remainder approach would be to think about how we make good the people who disagree with the decision we've taken, because there will be an effect. You might have people who are disillusioned. You might have people who are really upset or angry. So what do we do about that? So, and I think consequentialism also takes that into effect too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's really interesting. That's one part of the triangle, as we call it, one part. Tell us about the next part. That's the good.
That's the good.
And then you talked about the right.
Yes.
What's the right?
So the right really thinks about what is it that we owe to others as a result of our own positioning. We might think about this in terms of duty, that we have to others. So this really leans on. So in David's research, as he put this together, this really leans on the work of Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, who really thought deeply about this question, duties and rights. And here, we might think that our particular role, either as an individual or as an organization, bestows upon us particular duties or ways of being. So a classic example here might be if we are a medical professional, we have particular duties to our patients, perhaps to our organization, to our code, which we have to follow. So, and that is what helps us determine correct action.
Okay.
So it's slightly different to the utilitarian ideal, because you could arrive at a different answer. You might find, for example, that you're in a medical type scenario where if you're thinking about the greatest good for the greatest number, we could save 10 lives by taking an action, but actually in order to save those 10 lives, we might be absconding our duty to a single patient. So so interestingly, you might...
So there's tension between these two.
Tension between the two.
Yeah,
exactly, which is quite interesting. So what we say with this model is not that one is better than the other, but that to think, to enable you to perceive and think more deeply about ethical positioning, it's helpful to have an awareness of both of these things. So yes, that's really that. How should we act? Is the right. Yeah.
Okay. And the third part?
Yes, and then the third one is then the fitting. So you refer to Aristotle, and yes, I suppose if we think in terms of Western philosophy, we might think Aristotle and virtue ethics, and this is really about character and intrinsic belief or value system that we might have. So, does this feel fitting to us in terms of how we self-construct ourselves, in terms of how we represent ourselves? And this might come from a very, inbuilt sense of morality about what's right and wrong. It can be deeply personal. Some leaders I work with draw on childhood experiences or what they were passed on by their parents to them as means of guiding decision-making in this sense. Or it might be based on experiences they've had. It might be based on that nebulous concept of it's just the right thing to do. But in organizational life, this comes, this is represented as things like values, as culture statements.
Yeah.
And so this is also a really powerful notion. An example here we might look at in the corporate world recently is Patagonia, who I'd say are very, very virtues-led.
Yes.
They've recently changed their entire structure into a trust, and all profits generated from that point on will go into the battle against climate damage. So I'd say that was a very, there are consequential aspects of that, there are duty aspects to that, but I'd say it's also very fitting. It was very fitting with their brand and self-conception. So yes, and again, I think this can potentially be in tension with the other two concepts as well. But I think taken together, it can really enrich the way that leaders and teams think about and perceive and even identify ethical challenges, and then put together in a healthy, deliberative fashion how people can engage with each other to talk around these and ultimately come to a decision that not everyone may agree with, but we're very comfortable in the process and that we've done an exhaustive bit of thinking here.
You talked at the beginning about that when you started this, when I asked you about the philosophy aspect, you said, well, we're living in this tumultuous world, with kind of our esteemed leaders doing things actually that somebody described to me only yesterday as being quite dystopian, kind of more into a dystopian world. So where are you coming into organisations? At what level? Where is the demand for this? Because when you think about that, decisions are made by individuals every single day, multiple decisions, sometimes in minutes and within an hour. And the speed of change that we all experience, to kind of reflect back. Do people have the luxury of time in organisations to think about these aspects?
That's a brilliant question, and it is a challenge we sometimes get. So I think, again, just to restate, I think that it's because time is so short that we're under such pressures, that under such complexity. That's exactly why we need to do this work, because it's when pressure's high, complexity is high, that we really come under strain. And actually that's where the moments which, deeper thinking and care is rewarded. There are lots of different reasons why organizations think about ethics. I think still predominantly it probably comes from a control and risk mitigation kind of place. So, coarsely, we don't want to get sued. How do we keep the law in our jurisdictions and markets? Brand control, damage control. It can be a huge reputational problem for organizations to have an ethical failing. We've seen in industries in healthcare, in professional services, have some really public, often existential crises because of something that's gone wrong. And I think that's absolutely necessary, right? I think it makes total sense that organizations would think about this from a kind of compliance and control point of view. Where I and colleagues at Principia try to push our clients, though, is to think even more expansively. So yes, control and comply and think about the law, but actually in that context that we've been talking about, high complexity, extraordinary technological change, how actually can ethics help us think better and actually support us as a strategic tool to perceive, challenge, to deliberate in a better way, and ultimately act as a kind of stimulant for us. And that, I think, is less well done and less prevalent. I think fundamentally a lot of particularly corporate organizations still really driven by profit cycles, financial cycles, fixed periods of time, and don't really carve out that space to think longer term and to think more deeply, which I think is exactly what ethical theory can help us do.
Yeah, and I think so in my own research, one of the kind of biggest major trigger to toxic workplace cultures is this performance pressures. Not always to do with short-term profits. You also see it in the public sector. It's sometimes cutting back, cost control. But still performance pressures that come into that. But when you think around, the work that you do on philosophy, how deep do you go within organisations? Yeah. You're working at board level, senior leadership. How deep does it need to go?
Yeah, absolutely. So the short answer is all throughout organisations. There's a few different ways that we engage. So one is an ethical culture assessment. So this is a tool that's built around another triangle. Consultants love frameworks, as you know.
It seems triangles seem to be the popular one, right?
Absolutely. 3 is the magic number, apparently. So yeah. But this thinks about, so effectively it's delivered as a kind of survey tool to an organization. But around that, there's also a lot of qualitative research and conversations that go into it. But it effectively asks 3 questions. Are we responsible to act ethically? And you can think about that collectively or individually in people's roles. Are we capable? So do we have the skills, training, the right structures to enable us to actually do that, to do the work? And then thirdly, are we motivated? So for example, are the incentive structures in place for us to act ethically? Is there a sense that the organization encourages intrinsic, maybe the fitting type of motivation to think about ethics? So around that kind of core, we have this tool which assesses organizations on that and finds strengths, gaps, opportunities to think in different ways. So that's one kind of routine.
Can you give some examples of where you found maybe some of the gaps? I mean, you don't have to name the organisations, but maybe that, because as we're talking, I'm thinking of some of the organisational sort of stories or histories that we've got. We look at Wells Fargo, millions of accounts, fake accounts that were open as a way for employees to kind of cheat, really, which were a ridiculously aggressive sales culture and targets that they had. VW cheated on the regulators. I mean, that's quite explicit and very well sort of documented. And I guess it's like, well, if you'd applied this framework, would things have changed, do you think, in any way?
It's a really big question.
It's a big question. Sorry to put you on the spot.
It's a great question. Well, I think when I'm not sure, I'll always say yes and no.
Yeah, okay.
I think yes and no. So I think yes in the sense that, so for example, let's take motivation actually, because I think that's a big one. So the system will always fight back. And typically, so we do quite a lot of work in professional services, and there's a lot of great strengths and some amazing people working in that sector. But when we're thinking, for example, about partnership models, the system's default setting is profit cycle, growth and profit cycle. And therefore, behaviors which are geared towards that are heavily incentivized. And that's a real risk, because when those behaviors are problematic or damaging or, against other stated parts of an organization's identity, like their values, they can still ride roughshod over them. So that's something that we see. So I think that where we've had some really interesting, organizational thinking in some of our clients is, how do you actually build in ethics as part of your incentive, so that we're not simply thinking about bottom line, but we have multiple ways of thinking about organizational value and impact. So that's one way that I think it can really, really be helpful.
Just some examples of where organisations have done that. They've built it into the bottom line. Is it been through some rewards to individuals, or it has?
Normally we see that at the highest levels. So it could be among, executive functional leaders. So they will actually have to report as part of their own personal performance review on, what they've done to uphold. It depends on how they define ethics in that organization, but it might be around, upholding our ethical values, might be around, it could be a bit more instrumental, and it's thinking about a reduction in, or zero incidents or cases of misconduct or ethical failure. So yes, we've seen that built in, which is quite an interesting way. I also said no, though, to your question, and I think that does come from something I'm still grappling with. Is how the system adapts to survive, and I think that ultimately, we do work in still broadly capitalist structures, which has some helpful things and some, I think, really unhealthy things. I do think organizations which prioritize profit cycles have something really big to reckon with, because ultimately there's plenty of evidence we've seen over the last several centuries that actually that can be in real tension with more intrinsic virtue, with thinking about broader stakeholder groups. We've built a system where inequality is not getting better, it's getting worse. And so I do sometimes wonder about, how do we reckon with being able to change the system whilst we're also operating within it? And that's where I'm perhaps become a bit more pessimistic.
Oh. So we're kind of all doomed, I suppose. Is that what you're saying? Is that, we work in a kind of a, capitalist system with short-term pressure on short-term profits, and they are year on year demands back to sort of shareholders in many sort of, if you're looking at any of the FTSE or bigger organisations, or just profits back to someone. It's a tough world then, really, isn't it? So we're always going to have this. So there's a tension between the philosophies, but tension broadly in the context of what's going on.
I think that's right. Yeah, I do think that. I mean, I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well in some of the organisations you've worked with. But I think, I guess, the pessimistic case, I suppose, is that we're also going all in on. We seem to be going all in on that. If you think about the AI bubble that's happening, if you think about some of the license that's been given by political leaders to ruthlessly pursue profit at the expense of the planet.
Yeah,
with oil is in the news again. It's like where is this leading? And the only conclusion can be terrible consequences for the planet, unless we somehow innovate our way out of it, which I'm skeptical about. So I am a little bit pessimistic about that. However, what gives me optimism is, pockets of amazing leaders and people who really see this and do think differently. And I think, there are examples of that in every sector. So I guess, I suppose the other thing that I've been thinking about, I've recently written an article on emotions at work. And And I think the other thing that gives me optimism is the number of great people out there who are really thinking about putting the human first again in organizations, almost as a movement against what I've been talking about.
Let's talk a bit more about that then.
Yeah.
So what are you saying? Let's put the human first. What does that mean?
What does it mean? Well, it can sometimes feel like we're living in quite an anti-human world, I think. I'm sure you read LinkedIn, but it's just a complete soup of AI generated nonsense, frankly. And
that's an interesting summary for LinkedIn. It's a soup of AI generated nonsense.
Apart from your output, Susan, yeah. But the
flattery, yes, thank you.
Yeah. But I think so. I really do put my head in my hands at some of it, and I think ultimately people will stop.
When you say AI generated nonsense, tell us a little bit about tell the listener what you mean by that.
Well, maybe it's my own ear and eye, because I've worked with words for a lot of my life, and my PhD and book is ultimately about language and how how we talk about these things. But to me, it's very obvious when AI has been heavily leaned on for a piece. Now in and of itself, maybe that's okay. Maybe it's opening up forms of expression to people who might have not had them before, and it gives people different ways to communicate. But I think the way that a lot of it is constructed sounds very samey, and you see a lot of what I term correlative parallelisms. What I mean by that is you'll see text which says not only this, but this. AI is not just a tool, it's a way of being.
Okay.
So keep an eye out for those, but that's usually a dead giveaway. And it just doesn't feel like how humans would communicate to me. So I think So I think that's one example, but it's more than that. It's also, I was reading up against some of the statistics about graduate roles, which are now being lost to large language models.
Yes, absolutely.
Up to 30% in some of the big four. Now, I think there's other factors going on there. It's not purely trying to outsource everything to large language models, but there's economic factors and different things going on as well. But I think it's a huge part of it. And there's talk about moving from, the typical pyramid model in organizations to a diamond. So you have a much smaller kind of junior workforce and then a bigger middle. But again, I think this is tremendously short-sighted, because who's going to become that middle, right?
Yes.
If we're not accepting and encouraging and supporting people to grow.
It's a challenging model for succession planning, isn't it, really?
Completely.
So you don't start at the bottom, you start in the middle. I mean, yes, okay, that's
Spot
curious.
on, yeah. And I think that that will become existential for a lot of organizations. But that's another example, I think, of this kind of short-term rush to what's going to help us in the next 2 to 3 years, rather than thinking more deeply and further ahead.
What is it about AI that's so attractive then? Is it just, you touched quite a nerve there, I think, because I think everybody and listeners as well would be thinking around AI's touching their life. Some people might be using ChatGPT. We love the speed and the efficiency somehow about it, but it's not always as effective as consideration and thought and as you might kind of form words or think about analysing, trends, etc. What's your thoughts around what's going on with the way that AI is kind of sort of dominating the narrative?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. What is it that people are drawn to? I mean, I think part of it's almost a kind of similar force that we're experiencing in our political lives, which is being drawn to a solution which promises easy answers, which I think is one way of characterizing, the spurt in support for populism, for populist movements. In a weird way, AI does something similar, right? It promises us a world of knowledge that answers to our questions and problems, and it promises it now. But just as with populist politicians, there aren't often easy answers to the questions we're posing. Actually, yes. The real way to engage with things is with care, thought, consideration for the human aspects of it. I think that's part of it. I think there are efficiencies and useful aspects. I mean, I use it as someone who I have my own business. So to me, it's like having an unbelievably intelligent assistant.
Yes.
Who can challenge me and so on and provide ideas. So I think that it's clear why it can be helpful. And organizationally and business wise, people will see productivity, efficiency. It can help with those things, and therefore we're going to get better results. So I think it's an easy story to sell, but as you pointed out, I worry about what gets lost through that. And I do think things like, due consideration, human to human discussion and deliberation, human care for each other, these are things that make up the human experience. And I think a rush to AI means we really lose those things.
And I'm going to challenge you maybe a little bit this, because I'm going to come back to your book on diversity. And we do know that AI models have inherent bias because we have inherent bias in the way that research has been done and that over the years, etc. So there's quite a lot of, sort of work around about that bias. So it's not kind of a sense of, there's not a single sense of truth. Maybe that's something that feels attractive to people. That it's like, oh, I can look at this and I can watch the dot flashing, and then in 5 seconds I can get an answer to something. But it is only one, it is a perspective, a well-informed perspective. It could also be quite biased as well. We're beginning to see. Do you see that? Do you see it as a challenge for the future?
That's a great point. And actually in the book that I contributed to, The Key to Inclusion, I wrote a chapter on this exact question back in 2021 when it was plain old ChatGPT 2, and it wasn't yet a consumer model, and spoke about some of those very things. So, one thing that's been well documented is that AI is simply the product of human knowledge and experience, right? So in that sense, it doesn't think for itself. So it's there's one philosopher whose name I forget now, I'll look up later, but who uses the term the mirror. AI is a mirror. It plays back, it reflects what we put into the machine. And so in that sense, it will reflect back all of the foibles and biases and misconceptions that we have as well. I point out in that chapter that, those who work in this field as well, they're not particularly diverse groups. So you think about the Silicon Valley group, the way is very male, very, Western capitalist in its constructions and thinking. So again, there's limitations there to who is actually constructing these things. And that can be very dangerous. I think that there's some examples I cite in there where local governmental bodies in the US outsource decisions on who gets social housing, or, what level of funding we're giving to people who are on benefits, outsourced to AI models. That's life and death stuff, right?
Yeah.
That's people's dependencies. And that makes me really, really concerned, because I'm not confident that the calculus is being done by something objective.
Yeah. I want to come back now to kind of look at organisations and the philosophy and the triangle around, because and I want to reflect on the work on toxic workplace cultures, because it's something that troubled me. I had the toxic triangle. The toxic triangle that I looked at in terms of culture was that you can have toxic leaders, often sort of like would display sort of personality disorders, the sociopathic, narcissistic or Machiavellian tend to be the sort of dark triad of personality disorder as it's known. But you can't, they're not necessarily will survive unless there's a conducive environment, or what the literature talks about, susceptible followers, conformers, those that will conform for a quiet life, and those that may well collude because it may be in their career interests. And then I'm thinking, how would we, if we were to apply the philosophy approach to it and get people to think about it, it's sometimes quite challenging if we don't fix the fundamentals in that sense. So there's a tension in that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really, I love the kind of three prongs that you do in your research. I think that there is a philosophy angle you can take on an individual leader basis here that's helpful as well. So, historically, organizations have thought about profiling in quite psychological terms, the psychometric tests.
Well, I'm thinking if you had a narcissistic or potentially sociopathic leader, and we could probably all think of some of those, and may well be working or have worked for someone like that. Would they just throw the philosophy triangle to one side and say it's not for them, it's in their own interests? Or would you see could it have some impact?
I think it has impact in the sense that whether they accept it or not, they're already acting in one of those ways, right? As people, when we make decisions, we're actually instinctively, we're natively doing it anyway. Like if you think about a recent decision you've made that may have been difficult, probably when you analyze it, you'll think, actually, I was thinking mainly there about consequences. Or actually, a decision I made recently where it was really about what felt inwardly correct to me to do. So it was much more a virtues type decision. So I think one way to engage leaders on that who might be skeptical or want to throw it out is to say you're doing it. You are doing it already. And actually one of the ways we engage leaders is through that. We have a process of doing that, which is called our ethical reasoning profile.
Okay, tell us more.
Yeah, so that's something we do with very senior leaders. And it's a really fascinating tool, actually. So it's built around the good, the right, and the fitting, which we spoke about. And essentially, it's a conversation up to an hour that, and I've been running several of them recently, actually, so it's kind of fresh in my mind. But we'll run them through 2 or 3 fraught ethical issues. They're not quite dilemmas in the sense that there's probably a correct path, but nonetheless close to being dilemmas. And these include things like we try to take them outside of their day-to-day business setting. So one of the examples is it's around being a smoke jumping forest fire rescue squad. Okay. And you're faced with I'm not going to give it away, but
so you give them a dilemma.
But we give them the dilemma, and they have to reason their way through it. 10 minutes or so for each case. Another might be in a medical setting where you're given the option of saving 5 people, but only if you let 1 die. Okay, and the answer is one part of it, but it's really about seeing to what extent they are exploring those three ethical approaches natively. Like we don't explain what the good, the right, and the fitting is before, but inherently, naturally, people will do it. And so you can pretty quickly in 45 minutes to an hour get a sense of how someone weighs and reasons things ethically, where they're really strong, where they have depth, but also where they might have some blind spots, which is really interesting for an individual, but even more interesting when you then map that onto their colleagues' profiles as well, which is what we also do. So let's say you have a leadership team of 15, we'd run that profile with each of them. And then collectively you can get a profile which says we're very strong consequentialist thinkers. We think a lot about stakeholders, about remainders, and how we make those good. But actually we're not very good at thinking about or applying our values when it comes to thinking about difficult topics, or we're actually missing a bit on duty. And how we think about rights that we owe to others. What we do alongside that is to think about the process of deliberation as well. So, and in any decision, we perceive the decision. So are we perceiving as a leadership group the same thing? Often not. Actually, one leader might think that the question is a completely different one to another. So perception. Then deliberation. Do we have the right frames for how we interact with each other? Do we interact respectfully? Are we sure that the correct voices are at the table? Are there underheard voices that are missing? And then action. Do we ultimately come to the right call? And what do we do about the remainders afterwards? So we'll workshop that with leadership groups. Quite intensively, have them do some worked scenarios to pressure test some of these concepts. And it's really gratifying. We did a project about a year ago to then hear not only the leaders say we're still using those tools, and when I'm facing into difficult decisions, that framework comes up for me. But even hearing their peers or subordinates saying, I've detected a change in how they do it. And that might be, I've detected them involving a different voice when it comes to making a difficult decision, or I can see them really thinking longer term beyond the immediate consequences of a decision. So, so through that ethical reasoning profile, it opens up these kinds of decisions. And I think
that's so practical. It's so practical to think about that in a sense of what you just described, values, consequences, and duty. I mean, I'm just summarising the words that you use, but that's very, because all leaders will have dilemmas. And I think also when you probably play that back, I'm guessing that you're playing it into a room and there's a leader thinking, actually, I thought you guys would all be on the same, and I'm on a slightly different wavelength. So we are thinking differently, which is healthy, but we're not necessarily benefiting from the diversity of thought in the room.
I think that's so important because I think, naturally there will be diversity of opinion. Sometimes more or less, depending on what kind of leadership team we put together. But that's just humans, right? There is diversity. It just is. The key question then becomes, how do we, if we're missing it, how do we bring it in? But if we have it, how do we make a really healthy space for that to happen? And I think there are some really practical ways of doing that, which leaders often miss. Simple things like making sure that everyone has had a chance to contribute. And they can be very practical things like, do we rotate our chairs when we have regular standing meetings to help bring in different perspectives?
That's
or different,
very practical.
Different ways of doing
Other
things.
sort of practical things would you recommend?
I mean, it sounds so simple, but stuff like sending an agenda in advance of the meeting. Why is that important? Because
is that revolutionary in some organisation?
It really is. And I think the reason it is because there are different thinking styles within any team. So me, for example, I'm quite, I've learned to be a bit more agile on my feet, but I'm quite a reflective thinker. So I would prefer to have, key questions in advance so I can actually think about it. And that will enable me to contribute in the best way on the day. Other people are the same. And yet, if without an agenda in advance, that becomes much harder to participate. There might be other forms of neurodivergence as well, which make it harder or easier for particular people to engage. So an agenda in advance, rotating chairs. Another one that I like to do, particularly when running some scenario work, is kind of creating artificial roles. So let's say, we've got a particular item to discuss today, Susan, and I'm going to appoint you to be the devil's advocate. That means that your role today, you have license to just be difficult and just challenge the prevailing consensus.
That sounds a fun role to play, doesn't it?
It's great. And the point there is that we don't fall into groupthink or so that actually there's someone who might have a different point of view, but they don't necessarily feel comfortable sharing it. Well, here's the license to do it because we have a role which
I want to talk to you a little bit I've got time to talk about comfort and psychological safety. Do you think sometimes there's a danger that when we think about psychological safety, groupthink is about conformity, that we kind of assume that culture, if everybody's aligned to it, then we've got a great culture. And that's, I just think some of the tensions about what does a positive workplace culture actually look like? And if we're all agreed and everything else, is that a sign of a great culture? To my kind of instinct says, no, you actually do want people playing devil's advocate. You do want challenge. And I think, be able to have that healthy. So how would you distinguish psychological safety from being comfortable?
Yeah, I think it's a really big topic. So first of all, just how I would define psychological safety. And, a lot of the current thinking and literature goes back to Amy Edmondson's work at Harvard. She's done some terrific work. But essentially, I think how she would characterize psychological safety is the belief or the ability to speak up, raise ideas, raise concerns, dissent, but crucially, the ability to do those things without fear that I will be punished or humiliated in some way afterwards. And I think that can exist, in a broader environment as a kind of condition. It can also exist between two people, right? I might have more or less psychological safety with a given individual. It's been shown to be enormously powerful for many reasons. When I was at Included, before I went independent, we had a tool called an inclusion diagnostic, which actually measured psychological safety in organizations. And again, it would come up as the most important determinant of how included people felt. So more than things like transparency, more even than experience of microaggressions, more than things like transparency over pay, personnel decisions, promotions, etc. So really, really important. And and intuitively that seems right. If you have psychological safety, you're more likely to avoid reputationally damaging disasters which occur because somebody saw a problem but wasn't able to raise their hand and speak up. So yeah, I think really important. I do think it's different to comfort. In fact, I think in some ways it's the complete opposite of comfort. One way of characterizing psychological safety might be helpful discomfort.
Okay, say something about that. Helpful discomfort.
Yeah, I
Sounds
think
slightly painful, but okay.
well, I think it can be. I mean, I think, and the reason for that is that as you quite rightly said, psychological safety is not everybody agreeing with one another. It's enabling the conditions for disagreement to happen, and disagreement can be uncomfortable. But ultimately, helpful levels of disagreement can help us get to the right answer in a given context, or the right answer for us. So I don't think it's about everybody feeling comfortable. I do think it's everybody feeling comfortable, though, that they can raise their opinion or their voice without fear of being shut down.
Yeah. It's one of the key questions I ask on any surveys that I do, which is, can I raise a grievance or raise a concern without fear of reprisal?
Yeah, exactly.
And on an anonymous survey, it's sometimes you can almost spot sort of pockets of where you might well have toxicity, because where you can't do that, you don't have a healthy workplace culture.
Absolutely. No, exactly that. I do think there are some risks to the approach as I currently see it being practiced. So there's a couple of things. So one would be that psychological safety is not equally distributed. Right? And what I mean by that is that we know that there are particular groups who tend to have higher levels of psychological safety. Often it's when you're part of a majority group in an organizational setting. White men historically in a Western corporate setting have had very high levels of psychological safety. I'm generalizing, but
yeah.
Whereas if you are, say, a person of color, someone from a minoritized background, you are far more likely not to feel that. That's just the way things have been going, and I've certainly experienced that as well in my own career, thinking back. And so, but also even beyond those kind of personal characteristics, you might be someone who's a bit of an outlier in an organization. Deloitte is, somewhere we both worked. That's a great example of somewhere where you have all sorts of talents and backgrounds. I worked with people who are music graduates through to business graduates and so on. But there will normally be a prevailing culture. And so if you're someone who comes from a slightly different cognitive background, it can feel like you might have less capability to say and raise the issues that you want to. So I think, one thing is that it's not necessarily equally distributed, and we have to be aware of that. The other thing I'm seeing a little bit is that psychological safety can be used as a kind of mask or cover for more serious issues. So I've seen a lot of leadership teams cotton on to psychological safety. It's like, yes, this will solve all our problems. This is what we need. We need our people to be more confident in themselves and more proactive and so on. But actually, that elides the fact that there's a different kind of challenge in the organization. So I've seen this a lot with my inclusion work. I've seen leadership teams really cotton on to psychological safety, whereas actually they just have a problem about race, or they just have a problem about gender progression. And psychological safety can act as a license not to talk about that.
Oh.
It's a little bit feels somehow maybe less political or more neutral, as it's more intuitive to say, yeah, psychological safety, it makes sense. Is that stopping us, though, from having the more difficult conversation which we need to have?
Okay. So tell listeners, actually, I mean, I'm interested to know why. What keeps you motivated to do this work? What for you is the big motivation? I think we can probably allude to it. You've been very passionate the way you've spoken today, but what for you keeps you motivated?
Oh, it's the first week back in January, so not much at the moment. No, I think there's a few things. It actually maybe goes back to some of the things I shared right at the top. And this links, doesn't it, to the our own virtue system. Often those experiences we have early in life are the most powerful and the ones that stick the most. So for me, it really is, often that feeling, thinking back to that feeling I had of maybe feeling like a bit of an outsider, or, some of the experiences that my dad and other family members had, which were not good. And, that's a real motivator for me to try and help things better in the bigger picture. Whether I'm doing that or not, I don't know. Hopefully.
So better for, the next generation, better for people.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it links again to this, the kind of human, anti-human thing, right? Like, how do we ultimately, in organizations, places where people gather, they're really important spaces. That's where things happen. It's where people spend a lot of their time. And I think we've built up systems which are often so often mathematical, which is not necessarily bad, but it's predominated, and so kind of cold and sterile. So, anyone who's been through like a onboarding e-learning, or when they join an organization, or has sat through mandatory trainings or gone to some of these corporate events, they can sometimes feel so cold and leave you feeling somehow not human. And I think that's really problematic. And as I spoke about, I think we're possibly going even further in that direction. So to me, it's how do we put the human back at the center of organizational life? I think that's also probably why I practice other forms of creativity, like writing, and I've been doing training in acting for many years. These are things which are really about observing the human experience, or really engaging in deeply human experiences. And I think we need to do that because it's why we're here, and it's what makes life worth living.
Well, I wanted to ask you, just to kind of round off, put you on the spot a little bit and say, we talked a lot about philosophy. So, Nick, who's your favourite philosopher or philosophical quote? What would you to close this interview with?
That is a very challenging one. You see, I told you I'm a reflective thinker, so you might have to give me a moment. Well, actually, at the moment, I've been drawn a bit to the work of Ian McGilchrist, who's he's I guess a veteran, actually he's a psychiatrist, and as well as a philosopher and overall kind of polymath. But he wrote a really transformative book in 2009 called The Master and His Emissary, which is about the brain's hemispheres, the left and the right hemisphere, and effectively, the right is the master, the one who sees things in its whole and holistically, and the left is emissary, who goes off and does its bidding. And broadly defined, we might see, although both fall into art and science, the left may be more associated with science and cold hard data and facts and so on. And his thinking is that we're too enthralled to the left side. Okay, and that's causing all manner of cultural and social issues. And so it's not a particular quote, but I think that idea really, really resonates with me. And I think that's very readily apparent in, the rush to technological revolution that we're seeing. How do we really make sure we make space for art, poetry, human connection within a system which seems to really incentivize pursuing the kind of the foibles of the left side?
Okay.
Would be one thing to leave you with, but I'm sure I'll come up with a better idea later.
No,
as
I
soon
think
as
that was.
leave the
I
room.
think food for thought. And look, Nick, thank you so much. Thank you for spending time with us today. It's been an absolute fascinating discussion, and the time has just flown by. So thank you very much, and thank you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Huge thank you for having me. Thanks so much, Susan. Take care.
We started this podcast with the intention of having more honest conversations about what goes on at work. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, please be sure to share it with your friends, family, or maybe even colleagues. We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Not in the Handbook. Thank you for listening.